The merciless desert sun beat down on Matthew Harris as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon, each hoof fall sending echoes bouncing off the towering red rock walls. 20 years had passed since that blood-soaked day when he'd lost everything, but the memories remained as sharp as broken glass. He was just a boy then, hidden beneath an overturned wagon while his family's screams tore the morning apart. Now, after 2 decades of searching, he'd finally picked up Colonel David Wright's trail leading to Santa Fe. The saddlebags carried precious little besides Matthew's mother's silver locket, and the newspaper clipping that had sparked this journey, a glowing article about the reformed Colonel Wright, now serving as Indian agent for the territory. The irony of it all made Matthew's jaw clench until his teeth ached. The butcher who'd ordered the massacre of 37 innocent settlers, including Matthew's entire family, was now being hailed as a peacemaker. Rounding a bend in the canyon, Matthew caught his first glimpse of Santa Fe's adobe walls glowing pink in the late afternoon light. Smoke from cooking fires rose in lazy spirals above flat rooftops, and the mission church's bell tower stood sentinel over the dusty streets. He'd imagined this moment countless times over the years, but the reality felt hollow somehow, like a dream that loses its power in the telling. The Golden Spur Saloon offered refuge from the heat, its interior dark and cool as a cave. Matthew ordered whiskey from a weathered bartender named John Lewis, who'd clearly seen enough hard cases pass through to know better than to attempt conversation. The regulars gave Matthew wide berth, perhaps sensing the coiled tension in his lean frame, or noting the well-worn colt riding low on his hip. "Heard tell you're asking about Colonel Wright," a woman's voice said behind him. Matthew turned to find a striking woman in her 40s, her dark hair streaked with silver. "I'm Victoria Young. I run this establishment, and I make it my business to know when strangers come looking for trouble." Her eyes were sharp as hawk talons, missing nothing as she studied his face. Matthew considered his words carefully before responding. "Not looking for trouble, ma'am, just seeking answers about what happened at Broken Creek 20 years back." He watched her reaction closely, saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. 37 settlers killed, women and children among them. Figure a man ought to know why his family had to die. Victoria's expression softened slightly. "I remember that day. I was married to one of Wright's lieutenants back then, Michael Young. He came home changed after that raid, never spoke of what happened. Drank himself to death 2 years later." She glanced around the empty saloon before continuing in a lower voice. "Wright's not the same man he was either. Whatever happened out there haunts him still." The next morning found Matthew watching Wright's adobe house from the shadow of a covered walkway. The colonel emerged at precisely 8 o'clock, still ramrod straight despite his advanced years. His silver hair caught the morning light as he mounted his horse and headed toward the Indian Agency office. Matthew followed at a discreet distance, studying the man who'd populated his nightmares for so long. Over the next few days, Matthew observed Wright's routine, learning his habits and movements. But what he saw challenged his long-held assumptions. The colonel spent hours in meetings with tribal leaders, fighting for better conditions on the reservations. He advocated for peaceful solutions when younger officers called for military action. His voice carried weight with both sides, a bridge between two worlds. One evening, Matthew overheard Wright in heated argument with a junior officer outside the agency. "We cannot repeat the mistakes of the past," Wright insisted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen where that path leads, Lieutenant King. I've walked it, and I'll carry those sins to my grave. But we have a chance now to build something better." Matthew felt the certainty of his purpose waver for the first time in 20 years. Grace Lewis, a young woman who worked as Wright's clerk, became a regular source of information. She spoke of Wright's tireless efforts to prevent violence between settlers and tribes, of nights he spent poring over treaties and proposals. "He's trying to make amends," she told Matthew one afternoon, "though he never speaks of what he's atoning for." Her words echoed in Matthew's mind as he lay sleepless in his rented room above the Golden Spur. The turning point came when word reached Santa Fe of an imminent attack on a nearby settlement. Wright rode out alone to meet with the war party's leaders, despite warnings that it was a trap. Matthew followed, telling himself he wanted to witness Wright's true nature. Instead, he found himself watching as the colonel successfully negotiated peace, trading his own prized horses and personal wealth to compensate for broken promises and stolen land. As the sun set over the desert, Matthew realized his vision of revenge had become clouded by doubt. The man he'd hunted for so long was both the architect of his family's destruction and now perhaps the best hope for preventing similar tragedies. The weight of this contradiction pressed down on him like the desert heat, demanding a choice between the ghosts of his past and the future of others who might be spared his fate. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods as Matthew tracked Wright's movements over the next few days. The colonel's dedication to his work became increasingly evident. Each morning he rode out to meet with different tribal leaders, carefully documenting their grievances and needs in a worn leather journal. From his hidden vantage points, Matthew could see the respect in the faces of both settlers and natives when Wright passed through the dusty streets of Santa Fe. One afternoon, while Wright was meeting with a group of elders at the trading post, Matthew slipped into the colonel's office at the Indian Agency. He told himself he was searching for evidence of deception, some proof that Wright's reformation was merely a calculated facade. Instead, he found stacks of carefully written letters advocating for native rights, detailed plans for irrigation projects to help both communities share the scarce water, and personal correspondence revealing Wright's own struggles with the ghosts of his past actions. The discovery of Wright's private writings shook Matthew more than he expected. In one letter to his sister Grace, the colonel wrote of nightmares that plagued him, of faces that haunted his dreams, faces of those who had died under his command, both soldier and civilian. Matthew recognized his own family's tragedy written between those lines, not as a cold military report, but as a burden of guilt that had transformed a man. Victoria, the widow who ran the boarding house, noticed Matthew's increasing distraction. Over coffee one morning, she gently probed his thoughts. "Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself," she said, her eyes knowing. "Holding on to vengeance is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." Matthew wanted to dismiss her words, but they settled into his consciousness like seeds in desert soil. The situation grew more complex when news arrived of tensions rising near Amarillo. A group of displaced tribes was threatening to raid settlements in response to broken treaties. Wright immediately began preparing for the journey, despite his obvious exhaustion from weeks of similar negotiations. Matthew watched as the colonel loaded his wagon with trade goods and medicines, payments from his own pocket to demonstrate good faith. That night, as Matthew cleaned his rifle by candlelight, the weapon felt heavier than ever before. The smooth metal that had once promised satisfaction now seemed cold and empty. Through his window, he could see Wright's office still lit. The colonel's silhouette bent over his desk as he worked late into the night, preparing documents and strategies to prevent bloodshed. A memory surfaced, his father's words on their last morning together. "A man's worth isn't measured by who he kills, son, but by who he saves." At the time, Matthew had been too young to understand. Now, watching Wright sacrifice his comfort, his wealth, and potentially his life to protect others from experiencing the same loss he had once inflicted, those words took on new meaning. Dawn found Matthew riding alongside Wright's wagon as it headed toward Amarillo. He had approached the colonel in the gray light of morning, offering his services as an escort. Wright's surprise had quickly given way to quiet acceptance, perhaps recognizing something in Matthew's eyes that spoke of shared burden rather than continued threat. Neither man mentioned the past as they traveled, but its presence rode with them like a third companion. The desert stretched endless before them, the horizon shimmering with heat and possibility. Matthew realized that true justice might not lie in the satisfaction of a trigger pulled, but in the harder path of ensuring that the cycle of violence ended with him. His family's legacy could be one of healing rather than hatred, of prevention rather than revenge. The choice lay before him like a fork in the trail, and for the first time since that bloody day years ago, he felt capable of choosing the higher road. The unforgiving sun beat down on Matthew Harris as he guided his horse through the twisting canyons outside Santa Fe. 3 months of tracking had led him here, following whispered rumors and faded telegrams that pointed to Colonel David Wright's new posting as Indian agent. The thought of Wright living freely, respected even, made Matthew's stomach turn. The memories of that blood-soaked day 5 years ago when Wright's cavalry unit had murdered Matthew's family along with 24 peaceful Apache families still haunted his dreams. Through the shimmering heat waves, Matthew spotted a lone rider approaching from the east. His hand instinctively moved to his rifle, but he forced himself to remain calm as the figure resolved into a young woman astride a paint horse. She pulled up short, studying him with wary eyes. "You're a long way from anywhere, mister," she called out. Her voice carried the refined accent of an Easterner, though her sun-darkened skin and practical riding clothes marked her as no stranger to frontier life. "Looking for the Indian Agency," Matthew replied, carefully. "Name's Harris." The woman nodded, introducing herself as Victoria Young, the agency schoolteacher. Something in her direct gaze reminded Matthew of his sister Grace, before Wright's men had cut her down. He pushed the memory aside, focusing on gathering information. "How long you been teaching out here?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Victoria's face brightened as she spoke of her work teaching both settler and native children together, a program she said Agent Wright had championed despite local opposition. "He's done more for peace in 6 months than all the Army campaigns managed in 10 years, she said proudly. Matthew's jaw clenched at hearing his family's murderer praised as a peacemaker, but he forced himself to smile and nod. As they rode together toward the agency, Victoria shared more about Wright's efforts to prevent violence between settlers and tribes. She described how he'd faced down angry ranchers demanding military action over cattle raids, instead organizing meetings between tribal leaders and settlers to negotiate grazing rights. Each story twisted the knife deeper in Matthew's gut, complicating his mission of vengeance. The agency compound came into view, a collection of adobe buildings surrounded by gardens where native women worked alongside settler children. Matthew recognized Wright immediately, older and grayer, but still carrying himself with military bearing as he spoke with a group of tribal elders. The sight of him laughing and at ease made Matthew's trigger finger itch, but Victoria's words about peace nagged at him. That evening, Matthew took a room at the local boarding house run by Hannah Lewis, a widow whose husband had died in one of the Apache Wars. Her bitter comments about savages contrasted sharply with Victoria's idealistic vision, though even Hannah grudgingly admitted that raids had decreased under Wright's leadership. Matthew lay awake late into the night, wondering if killing Wright would undo the fragile peace he'd built. Morning brought news that a band of young Apache warriors had attacked a ranch to the north, killing several settlers. Wright immediately mounted up to investigate, taking only a native interpreter named John King rather than calling for military support. Matthew followed at a distance, watching as Wright rode straight into the warrior camp to negotiate. The man showed either remarkable courage or remarkable guilt. The warrior's leader was the son of a chief who died in the same massacre that claimed Matthew's family. Wright faced him without flinching, speaking in halting Apache as he reminded the young man of his father's desire for peace. Matthew's hand tightened on his rifle as he watched through his scope, but he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. The moment passed, and Wright succeeded in convincing the warriors to return the stolen cattle. Back in Santa Fe, Matthew found himself sharing dinner with Victoria and Hannah, listening to them debate the future of Indian relations. Victoria spoke passionately about education and understanding, while Hannah warned of the dangers of trusting too easily. Matthew remained quiet, his thoughts churning. The simple clarity of revenge had become muddied by the complexity of Wright's apparent transformation. A telegram arrived during their meal. More raiders spotted near Amarillo, moving toward Santa Fe. Wright immediately began organizing a joint party of settlers and Apache scouts to track them, hoping to prevent bloodshed on either side. Matthew watched the preparations with growing unease, recognizing that killing Wright now could spark exactly the kind of violence the man was working to prevent. As sunset painted the adobe walls blood red, Matthew confronted Wright alone in his office. The older man showed no surprise at seeing him, nor at the gun in Matthew's hand. "I've been expecting someone from that day to find me," Wright said quietly. "Not a day goes by I don't see their faces." The genuine pain in his voice matched the haunted look Matthew had noticed in his eyes. Wright made no move to defend himself as Matthew detailed the murders he'd witnessed. His mother Rebecca trying to shield his sister, his father Andrew standing unarmed before the cavalry. "I was a different man then," Wright said. "Following orders I knew were wrong. I can't bring them back, but I can try to prevent more families from suffering the same fate." His words rang with truth that Matthew couldn't ignore. Dawn found Matthew riding east, leaving his revenge unfulfilled. The weight of his family's deaths still pressed on him, but he carried something new as well, the understanding that justice sometimes meant choosing a harder path than violence. Behind him, Wright continued his work, building bridges between two peoples who had spilled too much of each other's blood. Perhaps that was a fitting memorial to those who had died. The desert wind swept across Matthew's path as he guided his horse through the rugged terrain, his mind wrestling with the decision he'd made. The sun-bleached rocks and sparse vegetation of the trail to Virginia City offered little distraction from his thoughts. He'd left behind not just Wright, but the singular purpose that had driven him for so long. The emptiness that remained felt both liberating and terrifying. In Virginia City, Matthew found the bustling mining town changed from his memories. Silver strikes had drawn new faces, and the once familiar streets felt foreign. He took a room at the boarding house run by Hannah, an elderly widow who'd known his family before the massacre. Her weathered face brightened with recognition, though sadness lingered in her eyes when she spoke of the past. "Your father Andrew was a good man," Hannah said as she poured coffee in her small kitchen. "He believed in building peace, not walls. Even tried negotiating with the cavalry before." She trailed off, studying Matthew's face. "You look so much like him now." The comparison struck deeper than Matthew expected, making him question if his father would have approved of abandoning the path of vengeance. Word spread quickly of Matthew's return. David, his father's old business partner, sought him out with news that would complicate his newfound resolution. "Wright's work with the tribes isn't sitting well with everyone," David explained, his voice low despite the empty street. "There's talk in Santa Fe of removing him, by whatever means necessary. Some folks prefer the old way of doing things." The irony wasn't lost on Matthew. He'd spent years plotting Wright's death, only to now find himself considering the man's protection. The desert nights grew longer as he grappled with this new challenge. His sister Grace's favorite doll, carefully wrapped in his saddlebag, seemed to watch him with innocent eyes that demanded better choices than revenge. Reports filtered in of mysterious riders seen near Wright's agency. Matthew recognized the description of one, Michael, a notorious hired gun who'd done the cavalry's dirty work before. The same man who'd helped torch their homestead that terrible night. The past wasn't finished with any of them yet. In the cool dawn, Matthew packed his gear and saddled his horse. Hannah watched from her porch, understanding in her gaze. "Your mother Rebecca always said the hardest path is usually the right one," she offered softly. Matthew nodded, knowing what he had to do. The road to the Indian agency stretched before him like a test of his newfound convictions. The desert landscape seemed to mirror his internal struggle as he rode. Harsh yet beautiful, unforgiving but offering hidden springs of life to those who looked deeper. Scattered clouds cast moving shadows across the red rocks, like the shifting perspectives that had reshaped his understanding of justice and duty. Near Amarillo, he encountered Victoria, a young half-Indian woman who served as Wright's interpreter. Her dark eyes held wisdom beyond her years as she confirmed the dangers. "Wright knows they're coming," she said, "but he won't leave. The peace talks next week are too important." Matthew saw in her the same conviction he'd witnessed in Wright, the belief that change was possible, even at great personal cost. The sun set blood-red over the desert as Matthew approached the agency. Wright stood on the porch, unsurprised by his return. No words were needed as Matthew dismounted. They both understood that sometimes redemption meant standing together against the shadows of the past, even when those shadows wore familiar faces. The night wind carried distant hoofbeats, growing closer with each passing hour. Matthew checked his rifle and took up position, knowing that protecting his former enemy might be the truest way to honor his family's memory. The stars emerged one by one, watching silently as the past and present converged in the darkness, waiting for dawn to reveal which path justice would ultimately take. The scorching sun hung mercilessly over Virginia City as Matthew Harris dismounted his horse outside the Indian Agency office. His hand instinctively touched the old photograph in his coat pocket, the last remaining image of his family before the massacre at Yellow Creek. Colonel David Wright, now Indian Agent Wright, was inside that building. After 15 years of searching, the man responsible for ordering the attack that killed Matthew's parents and sisters was just 30 feet away, separated only by a weathered wooden door. Rebecca Young, the agency clerk, looked up from her desk as Matthew entered. She studied his dust-covered clothes and the hard lines etched into his face by years in the desert. Something in his eyes made her pause before speaking. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her hand discreetly moving toward the drawer where she kept a derringer. She'd learned to read men's intentions in her 3 years working at the agency. "I'm here to see Agent Wright," Matthew replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. Through the window behind Rebecca's desk, he could see children playing in the agency schoolyard, both white and Native American students together. It was so different from what he'd expected to find. The colonel he'd hunted for so long was supposed to be a monster, not someone teaching children to read. David Wright's office door opened, and the man himself stepped out to greet his visitor. The military bearing was still there in his straight spine and squared shoulders, but his eyes held a gentleness that Matthew hadn't anticipated. "Welcome, friend. I'm David Wright." He extended his hand, not recognizing the son of the family whose deaths he had ordered so many years ago. Matthew felt his fingers twitch near his gun, but forced himself to accept the handshake. "My name is Matthew Harris," he said, watching Wright's face carefully. The flash of recognition and pain in the older man's eyes confirmed everything. Wright's hand fell away as understanding dawned. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Wright said quietly, gesturing to his office. Rebecca watched them with concern as they disappeared behind the heavy oak door, the tension between them almost visible in the dry desert air. Inside the office, Wright moved behind his desk but remained standing. Maps covered the walls, detailed surveys showing tribal lands, proposed settlements, and carefully negotiated boundaries that had prevented bloodshed for the past decade. "I've been waiting for this day," Wright said softly. "I knew someone would eventually come. I just didn't know it would be you, Matthew. You were so young then." Matthew's hand trembled as he withdrew the photograph, placing it on Wright's desk. "This is all I have left of them. My father John, my mother Grace, my sisters Victoria and Hannah. You gave the order that killed them, claiming they were hostile sympathizers. They were farmers. They helped everyone who passed through. White, Native, Mexican. They harmed no one." Wright picked up the photograph with reverence, his eyes filling with tears. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of them, and the others. I was a different man then, arrogant, afraid, following orders without questioning. Their deaths changed me. I left the military and devoted my life to preventing more bloodshed. This agency has negotiated peace treaties that saved thousands of lives." "Is that supposed to make it right?" Matthew demanded, his voice cracking. "Am I supposed to forgive you because you found redemption? Their blood is still on your hands." But even as he spoke, his eyes were drawn to the window where more children were gathering for afternoon lessons. Native elders sat with white settlers under a shaded portico, discussing shared water rights. A commotion erupted outside, shouts and the thunder of approaching horses. Michael King, one of Wright's Indian scouts, burst into the office. "Raiders hitting the settlement at Crystal Creek. Mixed gang of renegades targeting both tribal and white homesteads. They're burning everything." The news hit Matthew like a physical blow. Crystal Creek was where his parents had died, history threatening to repeat itself. Wright was already moving, strapping on a gun belt. "Rebecca, send riders to the cavalry post and the tribal council. We need every man we can get." He turned to Matthew, their shared past suspended in the face of immediate crisis. "These raiders don't care who they hurt. Will you help us stop them? Or will you take your revenge now and let more innocent families die?" Matthew stared at the photograph still lying on Wright's desk, his family smiling back at him from across the years. What would they want him to do? His father had always said that a man's true character was revealed not by his past actions, but by the choices he made when faced with hard decisions. The raiders were already an hour ahead of them. Every minute he spent settling old scores meant another family might suffer his fate. Matthew holstered his gun with trembling hands, the weight of his decision pressing down like the scorching desert sun. "I'll ride with you," he said quietly, meeting Wright's gaze. "But this isn't over between us." Wright nodded grimly, understanding the temporary nature of their alliance as they rushed to the stables. The desert landscape blurred past them as they rode hard toward Crystal Creek, a cloud of dust marking their passage through the parched terrain. 4 other riders joined them along the way, 2 tribal scouts and 2 of Wright's agents. The scouts reported fresh tracks heading northeast, toward a narrow canyon that would funnel the raiders into Amarillo territory. "They're driving stolen cattle through Dead Man's Pass," one scout explained, pointing to the distant rock formations that rose like broken teeth against the horizon. "If we cut across through Rattlesnake Wash, we can get ahead of them." Matthew recognized the strategy, the same one his father had used years ago when tracking rustlers through this unforgiving country. The wash was a treacherous path, loose shale sliding beneath their horses' hooves as they navigated the steep descent. Matthew watched Wright take the lead, noting how the man who had once ordered a massacre now risked his own neck to save others. The contradiction twisted in his gut like a knife, making his vengeful certainty waver. As they emerged from the wash, gunfire erupted from the canyon walls. Two raiders had stayed behind as lookouts, their rifles crackling in the afternoon heat. Matthew's horse reared as bullets kicked up dust around them. Without thinking, he pushed Wright out of the line of fire, both men tumbling behind a boulder as shots continued to rain down. "Why?" Wright asked, breathing hard as they reloaded their weapons. Matthew grimaced, checking his ammunition. "Because my father would have done the same. He believed in justice, not murder." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he knew they were true. Together, they returned fire, forcing the lookouts to retreat deeper into the canyon. The sound of screaming drew them forward. Women and children from both settler and tribal families, held hostage by the raiders in a makeshift camp. Matthew counted at least 15 armed men, their faces masked, moving between frightened captives. He recognized the leader's stance. A man he'd seen in Virginia City months ago, bragging about cleaning up the territory. Wright's voice was low and urgent as they formulated a plan. "The tribal reinforcements will come from the north. Cavalry's approaching from the east. If we can create a distraction, draw their attention while the others move in." Matthew finished the thought. "We can get the hostages to safety before the shooting starts." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the canyon, Matthew found himself working in perfect synchronization with the man he'd sworn to kill. They moved silently through the gathering darkness, positioning themselves to spring the trap. The desert wind carried the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Help was coming, but timing would be everything. In the chaos that followed, Matthew lost track of Wright. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as cavalry and tribal warriors converged on the raiders' position. He focused on getting the hostages to safety, guiding them through the crossfire toward the shelter of a shallow cave. A child's cry made him turn. A young girl had fallen, exposed to the fighting. Without hesitation, Wright broke cover to reach her, scooping the child into his arms as bullets whined past. Matthew saw the raider taking aim and fired first, his shot dropping the man before he could pull the trigger. Wright's eyes met his across the battlefield, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Some debts could never be repaid, but perhaps they could be transformed into something else. As the last raiders were captured or killed, Matthew watched the families reunite, their tears of relief mixing with the desert dust. Wright approached him slowly, the young girl still clinging to his neck. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of their shared history. Matthew looked at the child, then back at Wright. "Now we make sure no one else loses their family the way I lost mine." The sun had set completely by the time they rode back toward the Indian Agency, the desert stars emerging like distant campfires in the darkening sky. Matthew's revenge had slipped away somewhere between sunset and starlight, replaced by something he couldn't yet name. Perhaps his father had been right. A man's character wasn't set in stone like the desert mesas, but was shaped by the choices he made when the moment demanded more than hatred could give. Matthew Harris stood at the edge of Santa Fe's dusty main street, his weathered hand resting on the worn pearl grip of his Colt. The setting sun painted the adobe buildings in shades of blood red, a fitting backdrop for what he'd come to do. 20 years of tracking had led him here, to the doorstep of Colonel David Wright, now Indian Agent Wright to the local tribes. The man who'd ordered the massacre of Matthew's family at Bitter Creek now spent his days negotiating peace treaties and advocating for native rights. Through the saloon window, Matthew watched Wright speaking earnestly with a group of tribal elders, his silver hair catching the lamplight. The man's reputation had grown legendary in these parts, not for his military victories, but for preventing bloodshed between settlers and natives. Matthew had arrived ready to kill, but what he saw gave him pause. This wasn't the same cruel officer who'd condemned innocent women and children to death all those years ago. Rebecca Lewis, the local schoolteacher, approached Matthew as he stood in contemplation. She'd become his unlikely confidant since his arrival in Santa Fe 3 weeks prior. "He's not who you thought he was anymore," she said softly, following his gaze. The guilt of what happened at Bitter Creek broke something in him. He spent every day since trying to atone. Matthew's jaw clenched. Atonement doesn't bring back the dead. The meeting inside concluded, and Wright emerged into the street. His eyes met Matthew's, and recognition flickered across his lined face. There was no fear there, only a deep weariness. "I wondered when one of you would find me," Wright said. "I've lived with the weight of that day for 20 years. Not a night goes by that I don't see their faces." He made no move to draw the pistol at his hip. Victoria Young, one of the tribal women Wright had helped protect from raiders, stepped between them. "This man saved my people when the army would have driven us from our lands," she declared. "He risks his life daily to preserve peace." Other townsfolk began to gather, drawn by the tension. Matthew saw the respect in their eyes, not for a decorated officer, but for a man who dedicated his life to preventing others from suffering as Matthew's family had. "Kill me if you must," Wright said quietly. "I won't stop you. But know that my death will likely spark a war between the army and the tribes. Everything I've built here, all the trust and peace, will crumble." He spread his arms wide, accepting whatever judgment Matthew would render. The weight of the moment pressed down like the desert heat, forcing Matthew to confront the true cost of his vengeance. Rebecca touched Matthew's arm gently. "Your family died because of hate and fear. Will more death heal that wound?" He remembered his mother's words on that final morning. "Our legacy isn't in blood spilled, but in lives touched." Looking at the faces around him, natives and settlers united in defense of this changed man, Matthew realized his mother's wisdom had finally found its mark. With trembling fingers, Matthew unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dust. "My family's legacy dies here," he declared, his voice rough with emotion. "Not in revenge, but in choosing a better path." Wright's shoulders sagged with relief, and something like hope flickered in his aged eyes. The gathered crowd released a collective breath, and Matthew felt 20 years of hatred begin to loosen its grip on his heart. In the days that followed, Matthew found himself drawn into Wright's work, using his own experiences to help bridge the divide between cultures. Rebecca's quiet strength became his anchor as he learned to channel his pain into purpose. The nightmares of Bitter Creek gradually gave way to dreams of a future where understanding replaced fear, and peace was built on the foundation of forgiveness rather than force. Time had transformed both men, the vengeful survivor and the reformed soldier. Their unlikely partnership became legendary in Santa Fe, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal. Matthew's family name lived on not in blood, but in the schools and treaties that protected both settlers and tribes. He realized that true justice wasn't found at the end of a gun, but in preventing others from suffering the same fate that had set him on his long journey of revenge. Years later, Matthew stood with Rebecca beside Wright's grave, their young son Andrew playing nearby. The old Indian agent had died peacefully, surrounded by those whose lives he'd touched. Matthew placed a handful of earth on the coffin, finally understanding that redemption was possible for anyone willing to change. His family's legacy had evolved from a tale of tragedy to one of transformation, proving that even in the harsh desert frontier, hope could bloom from the ashes of the past. The years that followed brought both growth and reflection to Santa Fe. Matthew and Rebecca's homestead, once a simple adobe dwelling on the outskirts of town, had grown into a thriving way station where travelers, settlers, and tribal members alike found rest and counsel. The legacy of peace that Wright had started continued through their daily work of bridging divides and fostering understanding between cultures that had once seemed impossibly far apart. Andrew, now 12, had inherited his father's keen eye and his mother's diplomatic touch. He spent his days learning both the white man's education and the wisdom of the desert people, moving effortlessly between worlds as only a child of the frontier could. Matthew often watched his son speaking with tribal elders in their native tongue, seeing in him the future that Wright had envisioned, one where understanding replaced fear and cooperation overcame conflict. The harsh desert winds still swept across the plains, but they no longer carried the bitter taste of vengeance that had once driven Matthew forward. Instead, the landscape seemed to whisper stories of transformation, its vast expanses a testament to nature's ability to heal and renew. The trading post they'd established had become a symbol of this change, its doors open to all who sought honest commerce and fair dealing. Rebecca's influence had spread beyond their immediate community. She'd established a school where both settler and tribal children learned side by side, breaking down generations of mistrust through the innocent interactions of youth. The sight of young ones playing together in the dusty courtyard, oblivious to the divisions that had once torn their peoples apart, brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened frontiersmen. On quiet evenings, Matthew would sometimes take Andrew to the high ridge overlooking the valley, where the setting sun painted the desert in shades of gold and purple. There, he'd share stories of the past, not just of the tragedy that had shaped his life, but of the redemption that had followed. He spoke of Wright's transformation, of the power of forgiveness, and of the strength required to choose a different path when revenge seemed the easier course. The trading networks they'd established now stretched from Virginia City to Laredo, creating corridors of commerce that bound communities together through mutual interest rather than force. Along these routes, stories traveled too. Tales of the former vengeful survivor who'd found a greater purpose, and of the military man who dedicated his life to preventing the very atrocities he'd once committed. In the town cemetery, Wright's grave had become a place of reflection rather than mourning. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by both settlers and tribal members who remembered his later works rather than his earlier sins. Matthew had commissioned a headstone that bore not just Wright's name, but words in both English and native languages. Here lies a man who proved that change is possible and peace is worth the price. The desert frontier remained harsh and unforgiving, but its people had learned to face its challenges together. When drought threatened crops, tribal knowledge of desert plants helped settlers survive. When winter storms isolated communities, traditional trading partnerships ensured no one went without. The legacy of violence that had once defined these lands was slowly being rewritten into one of cooperation and mutual respect. As Matthew watched Andrew grow, he saw in his son's eyes not the haunted look of someone carrying the weight of past wrongs, but the clear, hopeful gaze of a new generation. The boy understood the complexity of their history, but wasn't bound by it. Instead, he embodied the possibility of a future where different peoples could not just coexist, but thrive together in this demanding landscape. The story of Matthew's family tragedy had evolved into something larger than personal vengeance or individual redemption. It had become a testament to the human capacity for growth, for forgiveness, and for choosing a better path forward. In the end, justice had come not through the barrel of a gun, but through the patient work of building bridges between communities that had once seen each other only as enemies. Years passed, and Matthew found himself increasingly drawn to the work he had once viewed with skepticism. The Indian Agency office in Virginia City had become more than just a place of mediation. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose understanding over hatred. He thought often of that day when he'd first arrived with murder in his heart, and how different things might have been if he'd pulled the trigger instead of listening. One crisp autumn morning, as Matthew rode out to inspect a new irrigation project, connecting tribal lands with neighboring ranches, he spotted a familiar figure on horseback, John, now gray-haired, but still straight-backed in the saddle. The two men had developed an unlikely friendship built on shared purpose, though they rarely spoke of the past that had first brought them together in violence. "The reservoir's nearly finished," John called out as Matthew approached. "Should have water flowing to both communities before winter sets in." The project was their most ambitious yet, a physical manifestation of the cooperation they'd worked so hard to foster.